In this edition of reShape 333, I want to give to you part 2 of 3 parts. If you missed part 1, the link is in the description. You can click on it there. It probably would be wise to watch that one first. I'm giving you 3 possible options for your congregation, especially if your church is smaller, and particularly if your church is struggling, maybe even shrinking. Give me 333 seconds and I can give you option 2. In part 1, I suggested that the church landscape has dramatically changed and that changes are continuing now at an accelerated pace. I suggested as well that increasingly churches are shrinking and many churches, smaller churches in fact, are closing. And it can cause even the best of us to become somewhat fearful, maybe for our church and for its future. But I also suggested that I believe that there's hope. I'm convinced there's hope for the larger church, and I'm convinced that there's hope for the smaller church if you have, number 1, a deep level of commitment to your community, and number 2, a posture of what I called kingdom desperation. That is a commitment to do whatever it takes to be the church that God is calling us to be in our neighborhood, and remembering that it's not about me, but it's all about Him. That's the tough part. The first option I called refocused mission, and in short form, it really is a process for you to begin replanting your church. Option number 2, I call the reimagined model. This option requires a small church to think very differently about their congregation and think very differently about what in fact it means to be the church in our day, perhaps even be the church more like it was in Acts chapter 2. This option potentially requires fewer resources and possibly in the future might not even require a church building. You can try this option with what I call a both-and mindset. That is, we're going to continue over here to do Sunday morning, our gathering there. We're going to continue to do that. That might be good for a church that still has a decent-sized congregation, maybe in the 40-plus range. But over here, we're going to try as well an experiment. We're going to do both. Or perhaps your congregation is pretty tiny, and perhaps you're ready to jump in with both feet because you have a real kingdom desperation. And so you say, we're going to try a pilot project, and we're going to even stop what we're doing over here for a period of time on Sunday morning, and we're going to try a new experiment over here for a period of time. This might be the best option for a tiny congregation with just a small number of folks to try a really creative experiment. The reimagined model option empowers a church to embrace its smallness. Perhaps the gathering becomes a dinner church where a few folks gather around a meal, and then after the meal they gather around the room and enter into maybe a time of prayer and a time of conversation, maybe a time of teaching, maybe even some worship. It could be far more relational in shape, in fact, and more meaningful possibly in the way that people connect. Or perhaps it's a house church that gathers weekly in someone's home, or maybe it's a cafe church where you find a convenient location and you gather weekly over coffee and conversation and dessert before entering into a time of conversation, perhaps some prayer, maybe some teaching, and maybe even a time of worship. Is it possible for some churches to shape this option in such a way that a younger family might even be interested in coming, or a younger person might be interested in connecting? Or maybe all your folks are a bit older. Maybe even, in fact, your community has an older makeup in its demographic. Could there be something that's shaped for the older crowd? Maybe even something that meets in a seniors complex using their multi-purpose room. Is that a possibility? It's really about both understanding your congregation on the one hand and understanding your community on the other hand, and the context in which you find yourself. I'm sure for some of you, just hearing this sounds like a huge and maybe even impossible jump. But maybe, just maybe, with a posture of kingdom desperation, you could try an experiment. Put a time frame on it. And maybe we'll even experience some wonderful kingdom results. Maybe it becomes even something more meaningful than perhaps what you're doing currently. Maybe. For the small and shrinking church that wants to have a future, can I just say, before dismissing it, it might be worth a second thought. We developed a course to get you dreaming. It's called the Launch Course. The link is in the description below. You simply need to pull a small team together. The course is video driven. You can do it all on your own. It's 13 weeks and it leads you towards an imaginative experiment that you can try. The link is in the description below. If you're interested, I'd love to chat with you about it. Don't click pause yet. There's a few questions coming up on your screen for reflection and maybe some discussion.